Hello, and welcome back to Lecture 3 of the Foundations in Kinematic Analysis lecture series. In the previous lecture, we gave you an introduction to what motion tracking is. One of the benefits of video-based motion tracking is that it can be used retrospectively on existing data sets. So, if you collected video data for a previous study, and now you have an idea of how to do kinematic analysis on that data, you can do those analyses. However, the quality of your motion tracking data also depends on your video quality and your recording setup. In this lecture, we'll give you some tips for optimizing your data collection methods with video-based motion tracking in mind to help you get the most accurate tracking. Of course, one of the most important factors will be the video camera that you use to collect the data. So let's talk about camera settings. First, you should consider the frame rate of the camera, which is how many still images or frames the camera captures and plays back per second. A frame rate of 30 frames per second means that you'll capture the position of the wrist about once every 33 milliseconds, whereas a frame rate of 60 frames per second means you'll capture the position of the wrist about every 16 to 17 milliseconds. A higher frame rate means more data, and this is a good thing because it gives us higher temporal resolution, but it also requires more processing power. Another really important camera setting is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the length of time that the camera's shutter stays open, and this controls how long the sensor is exposed to light. For fast shutter speed, the shutter stays open for a shorter time, which means that less light can pass through. This means that you will need more light in your environment. Importantly for us, a fast shutter speed freezes motion, whereas a slow shutter speed blurs motion because the shutter is open for longer. For example, a fast shutter speed can capture fast-moving subjects like a person running or a bird in flight, whereas a slow shutter speed might be used to blur or smooth a waterfall or to capture the northern lights. If you've manually annotated gestures using the ELAN multimedia annotation tool, you're probably familiar with the concept of motion blur, where the participants' hands look blurry on still frames like this one. This motion blur makes it more difficult for video-based motion tracking models to estimate the body landmarks, which introduces more inaccuracies. To reduce motion blur, you want to use a fast shutter speed. Another camera setting to be aware of is aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening around your camera lens. This also controls how much light enters the camera and determines the depth of field or how much of the scene is in focus. Your camera shutter speed and aperture settings together will determine how much light you need in the room. For example, if you're using a camera with a high shutter speed and smaller aperture, you may need to add additional lighting to your data collection room. Next, you want to consider the resolution of your camera. Resolution determines the number of pixels available for the model to work with. At higher resolutions, the camera will capture more detail, especially for the hands and face. In general, we recommend to record at a resolution of 1080 pixels or higher. So to give you an example, in our interaction lab at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, we use cameras with kinematic analysis in mind that capture recordings at 50 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/250, which means that the shutter is open for 0.004 seconds. We compensate for this faster shutter speed by adding studio lighting with 2 lighting panels directed at each participant we're recording. We use multiple panels to light the participant from both sides to avoid shadows. But of course, it's important to make sure that the light isn't too bright that it's uncomfortable for the participants. So to avoid that, we use a diffusion fabric over the lights to soften the output. And if you're using extra lighting, you might also need to avoid reflective surfaces like shiny tables to reduce glare. Ideally, you want to place 2 light panels at about a 45-degree angle on either side of the camera and angled downward towards the participant. This creates an even illumination. And if your room has a window, make sure that the window is also behind the camera and not directly behind your participant. Otherwise, the participant will be backlit, making them dark and underexposed. We'll also be giving you a tour of our interaction lab at the MPI so that you can see what a recording setup might look like. So let's talk about some other practical considerations that may affect your motion tracking quality. Video-based motion tracking models look for people in the camera frame. So you want to remove any other people from the field of view who you're not interested in analyzing. For example, you want to remove the experimenter and also any pictures that contain faces from the field of view, as these might be detected by the model. In general, you want to collect data in a room that is uncluttered with a simple background. So unfortunately, that means most data collection rooms are pretty boring by design. You also want to capture your participant with high contrast. So it's helpful if they do not wear clothes that blend into the wall behind them or with their skin tone. And they should also not wear excessively baggy clothes. For example, this participant is wearing a dark brown cardigan against a black background with lots of shadows. And this lack of contrast between the person and the background might result in tracking inaccuracies as the model tries to estimate where the joints are. Another important factor to consider is camera angle. If you take a look at these video frames on the right, one thing you'll notice is that each speaker is recorded at a slightly different angle, one from a slight right angle, one from a slight left angle, and one straight on. This can make it difficult to compare gestures across participants, depending on what measures you're using. This is something we'll discuss how to deal with in Lecture 5, but to make your life easier, it's best if you can control the camera distance and angle so that it's consistent across all of your participants. In general, we recommend capturing your participants from a direct, straight-on angle. You should also try to capture as much of the participant's body as possible. Here, the top and bottom video frames capture a nice field of view, including part of the participants' lower bodies and all of their upper bodies. In contrast, the middle video cuts off much higher. Not only will this result in us missing some of the gestures he produces, but the motion tracking might be less stable, and not having the hips visible will pose problems for us down the road because we'll use the hip landmarks to help us normalize participants to the same size in Lecture 5. Increasing the distance between the participant and the camera can help you capture a larger frame of view, which is great for making sure you're capturing the participant's entire gesture space. However, the farther away the camera is, the fewer pixels the participants' bodies and hands will occupy. And this means that you're sacrificing some pixel resolution, which can impact tracking. So you want to keep the camera as close as possible. So this is the simplest case when you are collecting data from one participant and using motion tracking to analyze their gestures from a single camera. This is the case for all of the participants in the toy dataset that we'll be analyzing in this lecture series. Another good option is to record your participant from multiple camera angles. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, MediaPipe does give us inferred Z coordinate values for each landmark. But these are inferred from its training data and not as reliable as the X and Y coordinates, which are directly estimated from the image. If you record from multiple cameras with different angles, you can actually perform triangulation to reconstruct body landmark locations in true 3D coordinate space. This is beyond the scope of this lecture series, but I want you to know that it's an option as you're thinking about camera setups. In the description below, we'll link to an EnvisionBox module that gives a tutorial for how to triangulate 2D motion tracking from 3 video cameras to get coordinates in 3D space. One limitation of video-based motion tracking is that it is susceptible to inaccuracies due to occlusion. Occlusion means that the point on the body you are trying to track is not fully visible to the camera, and this results in tracking inaccuracies or data loss. A body landmark can be occluded if it passes behind another body part. For example, when one hand passes behind the other hand, which of course can happen when we gesture or sign. And occlusion can also occur if there are other objects in the video frame that block the view. For example, the microphone in this clip. Ideally, you want to keep the view of the participant completely clear, so avoid having things like tables in front of them that can disrupt the view of the hands. So, should your participant be sitting or standing? Really, either position could be fine, but there are a couple of things you might want to consider. One reason that I really like to have my participants sitting is that their body position is more stable, which makes it easier to compare across participants. In contrast, if your participant is standing, they might move around more, swaying, stepping from side to side, and shifting their torsos. This creates more variability in the motion tracking data and might make it harder to isolate wrist or hand movement from general body movement. But a standing position is great if you're interested in whole body kinematics. It's also possible that participants may change the way they gesture depending on whether they're sitting or standing. Sitting participants might gesture in a more restricted area in front of their torso, whereas standing participants might use a larger gesture space around them. And people generally gesture more when standing, so this is a good reason to consider standing positions. If your participant is sitting, make sure that their chair doesn't have armrests, as it might further restrict their gesture space or result in fewer gestures if they feel too comfortable in a resting position. Sitting participants also require a smaller frame of view, so you can set your camera closer. As I mentioned earlier, this is advantageous because the hands and body take up more pixels, which gives us greater spatial precision. In contrast, standing participants need a wider camera frame if you want to capture the whole body and to account for the fact that participants might sway or move around more. Of course, standing might not be feasible depending on your participant's age or abilities or the length of the task. But beyond that, it's a personal choice depending on your experiment design and measures of interest. So far, we've only talked about cases where we are collecting motion tracking data from a single participant. But what if you want to study gesture or sign language production in interaction? In this case, you might need to get more creative with your camera setup. So let's say you have 2 participants sitting across from each other having a conversation. The standard media pipe pose estimation model tracks only a single person at a time. So we recommend you have one camera directed at each person where they are the only person in the frame of view. When collecting video data for interaction, it's also typical to have one camera that captures the entire dyad, where both participants and the entire interaction space are fully visible. This is called a scene camera. Although it's possible to analyze interactional dynamics between participants using this scene view, many researchers use it more as a reference to capture gestures from another perspective, to help with timing synchronization across video cameras, or to double-check the data. One thing you might notice about this setup is that we are capturing participants from a side angle. And in this case, we are capturing each of the 2 participants from different angles, one from the left side of the body and one from the right side of the body. If it's important to you that you capture video recordings from the same angle, for example, if you want the dominant hand of both participants to be visible without occlusions, you can move one of the cameras to the other side. But of course, your flexibility and camera locations also depends on the size of your data collection space. Earlier in this lecture, I recommended that you record your participants from a straight-on angle. This is still preferred, but it's harder to do in interaction. If your space allows, you might consider recording participants from a slightly elevated angle over the shoulder of their conversation partner. You just want to make sure that the view of each participant is as clear as possible and that their conversation partner's gestures or head doesn't occlude any of the target participant from that angle. This is something that you have to play around with, but again, we recommend keeping your setup as consistent as possible across all of your participants. If you have more than one participant at a time, you might also want to consider using either directional microphones or headset microphones to record audio from each participant individually. This will minimize speech overlaps from turn-taking in each recording. And it will be easier to transcribe the speech of participants using automatic tools like Whisper. If you're interested in a tutorial for how to use Whisper to automatically get speech transcriptions from audio or video files that you can then import directly into ELAN or use for closed captioning, we'll link to a tutorial from our department's GitHub page in the video description below so that you can learn more about it. As we can see, it's often useful to record data from multiple devices during data collection. But this also presents a problem. When recording data from multiple devices, each one runs on its own internal clock and has its own sampling rate. If these clocks aren't aligned, the recordings won't line up in time. For example, one device might think an event occurred 3 seconds earlier than another. We need to synchronize these devices so that frame 1 from one camera matches frame 1 from the other cameras. There are 2 main approaches to synchronization. You can do synchronization during data collection, in other words, live synchronization, or you can synchronize after your data collection, doing post-hoc alignment. So at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, we've used a couple of different software systems to perform live synchronization. Both of these software systems are designed to capture and manage video data from multiple cameras at the same time to ensure recordings are synchronized. You can connect several cameras to a computer. The software then receives all camera feeds simultaneously and timestamps them using the same shared clock. These are both professional tools, so they can be a bit expensive and might not be accessible to everyone. If you're collecting a data set that involves many different types of devices, such as eye trackers, EEG, physiological monitors, motion sensors, or task event logs, another option is LabStreamingLayer, or LSL. LSL synchronizes all incoming data streams by placing them on a shared internal clock. So signals with different sampling rates and different hardware clocks still line up perfectly in time. And this one is free and open source, and it's widely used in psychology and neuroscience research. However, LSL is primarily designed for time series data, not for handling external video camera feeds. That said, there's an EnvisionBox module that demonstrates how to integrate webcam recordings into LSL using Python, which may be useful for you, so we'll link to that module in the video description below so you can learn more. And if you do not have a way to synchronize devices during data collection, you can align recordings afterwards. The most common technique is using a clapper signal. For this, you start all cameras or audio recorders independently, and then you make a sharp clap at the beginning of the session. When you import the recordings into a video editing software, you will see a clear audio spike in each file at the moment of the clap. You can use this spike to align recordings on a shared timeline. Then you can trim the extra lead-in and export the synchronized files. This is also how it was traditionally done in the film industry using a clapperboard. There's also an EnvisionBox module offering a Python script that automatically aligns separate audio and video recordings by matching the audio waveforms across files and then trims and exports them. So again, we'll link to that resource in the description below if you're interested in learning more about automated post-hoc synchronization. And now we want to show you a real example of our interaction lab at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics. We'll show you some equipment that we use and an example of a data collection recording setup. So join me now to meet a couple of my colleagues and see our lab space.
Hi, I'm Sekine.
Hi, I'm Bahar Tarakçı. Welcome to the Interaction Lab. Today we will walk you through how we use the lab. This lab is designed for collecting interactive and multimodal data. We are now in the experiment room where we test participants. You can see we have multiple cameras on the walls.
These cameras have high frame rate and shutter speed. They are also on movable arms so that we can adjust the camera angle as needed and record participants' gestures from multiple perspectives.
Right now we are using a dark colored curtain for the background. We asked participants to wear light colored tops without patterns so that there's a good contrast with the background. In this way, their gestures are easily detectable.
Here's an example data collection setup where two participants sit across each other. If you're doing experimental tasks, there may be a table in between them. So now we'll ask them to have a free conversation. We can adjust the cameras in the room so that we have one camera capturing the entire scene and one camera capturing a straight-on view of each participant. We made sure that the participant is captured from the front and their entire bodies in the frame so that no gestures would be out of the frame.
We also use directional microphones or headsets to get best quality audio recordings. In the current data collection setup, each participant wears a headset microphone so that we have high-quality audio recordings on different audio channels. This improves automated speech transcription, such as using OpenAI's Whisper, and makes it easier to transcribe speech when participants' speech turns are overlapping.
We add panel lights to the room so that the camera receives enough light even when the shutter speed is set to a high value. They have a diffuser covering so that participants don't feel it's too bright. We use one light directed at each participant. Each light is slightly angled downward to reduce shadows and potential for glare. They are placed behind the camera to avoid backlighting the participant.
This is our control room, where the experimenter can observe the interaction. One challenge of having this many cameras and microphones is being able to synchronize them. However, all the microphones and the cameras in the lab are controlled by the equipment in this room. Therefore, they are already synchronized without additional post-processing. Right now, we are recording the conversation from multiple cameras. All cameras are time synchronized. When an experimenter is sitting here watching the experiment, they can easily switch between the cameras to observe the interaction from different perspectives. For instance, if a participant is out of frame, they can detect it. This would prevent us from losing data points essential for kinematic analysis.
Thanks for joining us for a tour of the Interaction Lab. Our lab setup has quite a lot of equipment designed to capture high-quality audiovisual data. Thanks to its flexibility, we can record complex interactive language tasks and experiments from different angles and perspectives.
We know that not everyone has access to a lab with this much space or equipment. If this is the case, you can still collect high-quality recordings for video-based motion tracking with simpler setups, even with a single camera. We hope that this tour gave you some helpful ideas to think about, and we wish you good luck with your data collection.
And that brings us to the end of this lecture. We hope to have provided some useful information to help you make decisions about equipment and recording setups when collecting data for video-based motion tracking. In the next lecture, we'll have our first hands-on tutorial showing you how to extract motion tracking data from video recordings. We'll walk you through how to set up your computer with all the necessary requirements so that you can run the Python scripts and get MediaPipe landmark coordinates. We'll do this with our toy dataset using the videos that we provide, but you can also try it on your own video data. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you then.